Patrick is the first person, to my knowledge, to write a book on Muqtada AlSadr. He also obviously has a deep knowledge of the wider issues in Iraq, so people can ask him later about those. He's been covering Iraq since 1977. It is a very difficult place to operate in, and that is illustrated in Patrick's book at the very beginning, where Patrick describes a brush with death, where he encounters a checkpoint run by Mahdi Army militia. They are, I think, armed with Kalashnikovs and rocket-propelled grenades. You have tried to disguise yourself wearing an Arab headdress, but surprisingly, they saw through that and I think ripped off your headdress and said, "You're a spy, you're an American spy." So that was Patrick's brush with the Mahdi Army militia. And then their boss, their leader, he describes in his final chapter saying, Muqtada AlSadr is the most important and surprising figure to emerge in Iraq since the US invasion. He is the messianic leader of the religious and political movement of the impoverished Shia underclass, whose lives were ruined by a quarter of a century of war, repression and sanctions. From the moment he unexpectedly appeared in the dying days of Saddam Hussein's regime, US emissaries and Iraqi politicians underestimated him. So far from being the firebrand cleric, as the Western media often described him, he frequently proved astute and cautious in leading his followers. His grasp of what ordinary Iraqis felt was to prove far more sure than that of the politicians isolated in the green zone in Baghdad. Patrick goes on. Had life become easier in Shia Iraq after Saddam Hussein, this might have undermined the Sadrist movement. Instead, people saw their living standards plummet as provision of food rations, clean water and electricity faltered. Saddam's officials were corrupt enough, but the new government, cowering in the green zone, rapidly turned into a kleptocracy comparable to Nigeria or the Congo. Now we're going to talk a bit later about Muqtada AlSadr, what made him, what motivated him, but first we're going to get Patrick's views on the latest confrontation in Basra.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's extraordinarily interesting, but it's almost it's a sort of cameo of what the real political landscape of Iraq is like, as opposed to the sort of happy stories of you know, how the surge has made things better. Yes, it has made things better, but in terms of, you know, the complete bloodbath of a year ago and a sort of 50% bloodbath now. But you know, over the last year, one could sense, and as a journalist, I was rather able to fight against the idea that somehow the Iraqi army had all come together, could do things, that somehow Muqtada AlSadr was a back number, things were getting better, that Baghdad was under control, that shops were opening. And then suddenly this happens, and three-quarters of Basra is immediately controlled by the Mahdi army. The Iraqi army does nothing, probably half Baghdad, and not just the Shia areas. And then suddenly, you know, it was meant to be, Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister, said, well, in 72 hours, all militiamen must give up their weapons, which was unlikely since Saddam never managed to disarm Iraq. But, and 72 hours later, Iraqis are watching on television Iraqi police and army handing over their weapons to the Mahdi army and getting sprigs of olive branch and a Quran in return. And then there was a figure not known here, but known in Baghdad, al-Sheikhli, who was the Iraqi spokesman on the surge, the Baghdad security plan, and who'd been continually on TV at the US Embassy and elsewhere, the US military saying the surge is working, things are getting better in Baghdad. Well, last week, suddenly he was kidnapped, which isn't too surprising in Iraq, but what was slightly surprising was he was kidnapped by the Iraqi police commandos in full uniform with the, you know, the vehicles they use, monikers, they call them, you know, the, named for some reason after Monica Lewinsky, the police vehicles in Iraq. It's the belief that they somehow resemble her, but the drove up to his house, shot dead 3 of his bodyguards, set fire to the house, kidnapped him. This was the Iraqi police commander. So it shows that, you know, the real Iraq, you have a police commandos, you know, this looks like any other country, but actually they work for somebody else. So I think the real political landscape of Iraq appeared. And then it ends because the Iranians do a deal, not the Americans.
And Muqtada AlSadr emerges stronger in your view?
Emerges stronger in a very sort of, but again, the situation extremely messy. What's really been agreed? Nobody quite knows. Well, they know what's been agreed, but will it be followed through? And with great likelihood that this is a lull rather than anything being decided.
And why do you think he did do that deal when he did? And why did the government take on Sadr when they did?
I think, one, they tend to, I mean, they live in the green zone. They tend to be arrogant, you know. They sort of, you have these conversations in the green zone with Iraqi politicians and diplomats, which is just so different from the reality outside the green zone. They all talk to each other. So, I mean, hubris and misinformation. Malik is famous among the other people, I mean, other Iraqi politicians. You know, he comes from a conspiratorial party, Dawa, only talking to them. And then we got the provincial elections in October. Now, probably it's almost certain that the Sadrists will do very well in the elections, and the Maliki's party and the other big Shia party, the Supreme Council, will do badly. It seems that he was under pressure to take control of towns and cities, because the idea is that if you control a town or city, you can probably control the vote come October. That's another good probable motive of why they did it now, I think.
Let's get back to Muqtada AlSadr, the man. He's only 34 years old. What motivates him? What's his game plan for Iraq? And why has he been so successful?
Well, he's always been against the occupation. That's a constant sort of policy theme. After all, they keep on being described as, the New York Times for a long time, until a week or so ago, always described him as the renegade cleric. Why is he a renegade? You know, he's never changed parties, he's never changed his views. And then there are these other awful...
Presumably because he was an enemy of Saddam Hussein, his father was assassinated by Saddam Hussein, he should have been a friend of the Americans. Do you think...
I don't think so. I think it's just a sort of term of abuse, isn't it? I mean, it's just sort of saying somebody we don't like. He's always been against the occupation. I mean, he comes from the most famous clerical sort of family in Iraq. His father, he appeared so suddenly because he inherited his father's movement, which was really a movement of the Shia poor under Saddam, mixture of nationalism and religion. And he sort of recreated that. I mean, after all, you must have seen this in Najaf and places. As soon as he appeared, there were posters everywhere showing Muqtada, his father, who was assassinated by Saddam in 1999, and his father-in-law, Mohammed Bakr al-Sadr, who was the sort of founder of the sort of main Iraqi Islamic Party, who was executed by Saddam in 1980. So it was kind of a family of martyrs, and behind them there's the Iraqi flag. It's kind of, that's the sort of essence of his ideology, if you like, which is sort of religion, Shiism, nationalism.
And you argue in the book, don't you, that what helped him was not just mistakes made by the Americans after the war, but also sanctions, because they impoverished Iraqis and boosted the Sadrist trend.
Yeah, I mean, after all, Iraq was becoming more religious at that time. Everything had been a disaster for Iraqis from 1980 on, from the start of the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, 500,000 people are killed, wounded, or prisoner. The country becomes impoverished. The first Gulf War, the Shia uprising, maybe 100,000 are killed. And then you have UN sanctions. Society breaks down. The vast numbers of people who did have a reasonable life suddenly have nothing. And Muqtada's father was one of the few people who sort of successfully misled, at least for a time, Saddam. Saddam thought it would be a really smart idea after the Shia uprising of 91 to have his own Arab Shia cleric who would sort of tame the Shia clergy. So he let him develop this mass movement until he and the Iraqi Mukhabarat noticed that one name was never praised by this man, by Mohammed Sadiq, which was Saddam, which is unheard of in Iraq. You know, everybody sort of, you know, every newspaper, I think everybody had to say praise of Saddam every 10 seconds, and that he was a very dangerous enemy, and then he had him killed, along with his two sons.
Moving forward, the Americans come into Iraq. You have described Muqtada AlSadr as the ultimate American nightmare in Iraq, the black-turbaned, virulently anti-American Shia cleric. And you say one of the grossest US errors in Iraq was to try to marginalize him and his movement. What should they have done differently?
Well, I mean, what should they have done differently in general sense, which was not occupy Iraq? It was slightly different. No, it's a good, it's an important point, because people always put together two things, which is overthrowing Saddam, which most Iraqis were in favor of, and occupying Iraq, which is rather different. The second doesn't always follow the first, doesn't necessarily follow the first. Tony Blair, George W. Bush always speak as though occupation naturally followed from the overthrow of Saddam. And if you're against the occupation, you're somehow in favor of Saddam. The two things don't follow at all. Most of the opposition leaders, people like the Barzanis and the others, in favor of getting rid of Saddam, much against the occupation. So the two things don't necessarily follow, I think, as a way that, you know, that is pretended. How should they have dealt with him? Well, they should have dealt with him, and what have they got against him is that he's against the occupation. They obviously want to occupy. The Americans had a problem from the very beginning, which was, if they overthrew Saddam, who was going to benefit? Well, first of all, if there's an election, it's going to be won by the Shia, because they're 60% of the population, and not the Sunni. They're going to take charge. It's probably going to be the religious parties that do it. People in black turbans, and there are a lot of people in black turbans who are closely connected to Iran. They didn't want the Iranians to benefit. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of the American dilemma, which they never really resolved, is somehow they want a solution which doesn't have the Iranians benefiting and people running Shia religious parties benefiting. But it can't be done, and you can only stop it happening. You've got a lot of American troops there. So they keep on trying to find people who initially who would be sort of Iraqis who are going to be there instead, who initially were people in neat suits who spoke English, who, you know, been to American universities, except then they found they got no support. But I think it goes on right to the present day. I mean, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of, on the 20th of March, just this happened, by one of Paul Bremer's spokesman, Dan Senor, saying, whatever happened to Muqtada AlSadr? And finally we've won, and Muqtada AlSadr is completely marginalized and unimportant and so forth. And it's a delicious read, because no sooner was the ink dry than every single word was immediately sort of shown to be false by events. But it has been a continual American desire to find somebody who is somehow not too closely connected with the Iranians, who isn't, you know, who kind of is on their side, but there's always a disadvantage. That person's main political card is his friendship with the Americans. He doesn't have much else going for him.
What about Muqtada AlSadr's links with Iran? You, in your book, you quote a Sadrist militant saying Iranian intelligence started giving $800 to anyone who would attack the Americans or assassinate some Iraqi figures. People were given lists of names of former Baathists, present-day political figures or ordinary people to be killed because they were meant to be working against society. If they refused to do what they are told, then they face death. Iranian intelligence secretly recruited young people to train in Iran. They give volunteers $300, $400 a month, train them to use weapons and to fight the Americans. It is easy enough for Iranian intelligence to persuade a man to join the groups it controls through money and good weapons if he is unemployed and the Mehdi army pays no wages.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, there are units of the Mehdi army that are controlled by the Iranians, and the Iranians have always wanted to have, particularly if they think the Americans are going to attack them, they want to have assets within Iraq, which is not too difficult to do. And when you've got half the population unemployed, raising an army is one of the easiest things you can do if you can afford to pay people. And they do it.
And how comfortable does Muqtada AlSadr feel with those links with
Well,
Iran?
you see, the Sadrs, his family were always anti-Iranian. They're Arabs. Well, Sistani, others, big leaders, important leaders, the Al-Khoury family, a lot of the others are of Iranian origin. His family are not. They were always anti-Iranian. The Iranians didn't like them much for any reason. But then when the Americans put pressure on them, you know, the enemy of my enemy. So then they started going to Iran. From 2004, I remember they toned down their anti-Iranian rhetoric because the Americans put a lot of pressure on them. They think we need some friends. You know, and obviously they get weapons, but at a certain, I mean, this is true and it's important, but at a certain point it gets exaggerated. Aha, so we have the Mahdi army because they're created by the Iranians, but this is not true, you know, and weapons, you know, if you have money in Iraq, you can get weapons. You can get an enormous amount of weapons. You don't, you know, one of the Mahdi army's complaints about the Iranians is they don't sort of get weapons. There's the incredible amount of money the Iranians charge them for buying weapons. So you expect them to produce a denial. And they say, no, but God, my God, you know, the amount of money they could charge you. Which, of course, again, is very Iranian. Then you're not quite sure. Is the Iranian government doing this, or is somebody else doing that? Or is it the Iranian government and somebody in the Iranian government is turning a profit? But, I mean, the actual acquisition of weapons is quite easy. I mean, up to quite late, Iraq was still exporting, I don't know, they're still doing it, weapons to Saudi Arabia. Just because you could get a better price in Saudi Arabia than you could in Iraq, because there were so many weapons there, the market price had gone down.
On the issue of repression of women and quite a large numbers of women being killed in Basra, to what extent can we blame Muqtada AlSadr for that and the religious intimidation there? I very well remember trying to go into Firdows Square, where Saddam Hussein's statue was famously toppled, I think in 2004, and being told that I couldn't go there without wearing a headscarf because there was a Mahdi army occasion there. And I also remember interviewing one of Muqtada AlSadr's men in Sadr City who said that women who didn't wear the veil should have rotten tomatoes thrown at them, taxis shouldn't pick them up, and even Christians should wear the veil because didn't the Virgin Mary wear one?
I know that. I hadn't heard that.
So
yeah, I mean, the people in Sadr
to
City, yeah, I mean, women who don't want to wear the veil generally end up wearing it there because of intimidation.
And is the intimidation coming directly from Muqtada AlSadr's men?
I think so,
or is
yes.
it part of a wider
Yeah, I think
pattern?
It is. I think it's sort of, I mean, it's, the problem is that all the religious parties are pretty similar on that. I mean, Iraqi women say that Fadila, one of the parties in Basra, is slightly better than the others, but they're all pretty bad. And it's very sort of difficult what can be done about this. I mean, I can't think what can be done about this, because it's pervasive throughout the religious parties that dominate the political life, I mean, the life of most of Shia Iraq. It's on jobs, the Sadrists want women separate, but women get jobs. I mean, part of the Sadrist thing, I mean, one of the big things in Iraq is simply job. What is the government in Iraq? I mean, governments in most of the Middle East are kind of a ferocious intelligence security service, and after that, the government's an enormous patronage machine. In Iraq, it's bigger than most. There are about 4 million people in Iraq, out of a population of 27 million, who work for the government or are on pension. There aren't many other jobs. The private sector is pretty small. And of course, it's very important to control ministries, because then that's basically jobs. So, for instance, one of the Sadrists wanted to control ministry as soon as they did, and all the other parties exactly the same. You take over a ministry, you employ everybody in your ministry. The Sadrists tend to give the jobs to both men and women, but they must work separately. So it's not like Saudi Arabia, but it's basically like an old sort of American-Irish political machine, but politically very important for people to know that you have jobs and that you have money.
What about Muqtada AlSadr's role in the sectarian conflict and in the death squads? Because he's a self-proclaimed nationalist. He's recently been quoted as saying he's Shia by religion, but closer to the Sunnis in politics. And yet, Patrick has some great interviews in his book with former death squad leaders. You talk about one man called, I'm not sure that I can pronounce his name, Abu Rasil, who apparently would leave a note on the bodies of dead Sunnis saying best regards. And his victims are found with drill holes in their bodies, their bones smashed by being pounded with gas canisters, and their hands and feet pierced by nails. And Patrick quotes a death squad leader saying, "It was very simple. We were ethnically cleansing. Anyone Sunni was guilty. If you were called Omar, Uthman, Zayd, Sufyan, or something like that, then you would be killed. These are Sunni names, and you're killed according to identity." Did Muqtada AlSadr condone that?
He never condoned it. He always condemned it. One could also say, how far could he have stopped it? I mean, I think in Baghdad, there were 2 years after 2003 where the Al-Qaeda was bombing Shia markets and so forth, big bombs. The Shia didn't retaliate that much, a bit, but not that much. Then after the Samara bombing in February 2006, there was a sort of complete explosion. I have parts in the book of some people, Sadr is saying they try to restrain people in Sadr city and elsewhere, Palestine, where the roads where there were Sunni driving to try and stop them, but they couldn't do it. There was sort of complete hysteria. They're dragging Sunni out of cars and killing them and so forth. And then they sort of developed a battle in 2006. And actually probably the crucial political event recently in Iraq was really a battle for Baghdad and central Iraq between the Sunni and the Shia. Really brought on by the Sunni, but it was the Shia eventually won, because they were the majority, and they took over, really control East Baghdad and most of North Baghdad. I doubt if there are more than 25% of Baghdad is Sunni anymore. Could Muqtada have stopped it? Probably not. How far did he try? Well, he says he tried. But at that point, the Mahdi army had become a sort of umbrella for all the militias that were very systematically, ethnically cleansing Baghdad. Since then, and then Muqtada says that this was one of the reasons for his ceasefire, to purge the Mahdi army. How far will that succeed? To a degree, probably, but unfortunately, when you have that number of people killed, this was running at 3,000 civilians a month being killed, and most of it in sort of greater Baghdad, then the degree of hatred and fear that built up is not a consequence of one person, and one person can't stop it. And even now, Shia and Sunni don't mix that much in Baghdad anymore, and feel sort of.
And presumably marriages between Sunnis and Shia don't happen anymore either.
No, not that I'm aware of, and quite a lot of divorces, because it's so difficult as well. And also people I've had sort of perfectly sort of liberal Sunni and Shia talking to me and sort of chatting to each other in my room, or even doing some work for me, and then afterwards come up to me and say, don't give him or her my address. Don't let them know where I live. There's a degree of nervousness. And I'm admitting, say, look, I've got nothing against that person. It just makes me nervous if I think they know where I live.
You've just come back. You were there, I think, a couple of weeks ago.
Sure.
What's it like there at the moment in Baghdad?
Well, it got immediately worse after I left, but it was pretty bad. People say it's got better, and in a sense it has, but it was, with the number of people being killed, maybe, is down to, I forget, the figures are completely unreliable now, because the government keeps pretending that nobody was being killed at all. I mean, it's sort of ludicrous. Sort of propaganda. A little easier to move around in central Baghdad. Every area sealed off by these enormous cement walls. They're sort of prefabricated enormous cement blocks. They look like enormous tombstones, grey tombstones. Some areas you see some, people in the streets, and But it's sort of it's fragile, and East Baghdad slightly better than West Baghdad. It's a favorite television shot, I think, which is of, you know, the happy market scene, people sitting in restaurants. But all that's very fragile. People can move into a restaurant in 5 minutes, they can move out of a restaurant in 5 minutes. So shortly after I'd left, all that sort of disappeared, complete curfew, nobody is there. And even sort of areas like Al-Mansur that were slightly once upmarket shopping areas. A friend of mine emailed me a couple of days ago saying he'd been walking there and then suddenly a couple of cars sort of with smoked windows that he thought must be sort of senior officials drew up, but it wasn't, because the Mahdi army started opening fire on the police. So so all that sort of is very fragile.
And meanwhile, where is Muqtada? I mean, it's very elusive, fairly reclusive. Did you ever get to meet him?
I've met him, but I didn't. When I did the book, I decided to do it completely unofficially, because I thought that's the only way I get information. If they know that I'm looking for information or getting other people to talk to people from the Mahdi army, it just won't happen, or it'll be so dangerous I'll have to stop. And it could only be done unofficially. And that was possible to do. But he's in Qom most of the time now. He comes back to Najaf. People around him say, oh, he's often in the house when people think he's in Qom. But, and that is probably true. I mean, Iraqi ayatollahs, religious leaders often are in the house for long periods and don't go out. You know, I forget when Sistani was last out, maybe when he came to London, but I think he's been out since. So it's not uncommon. And often they disappear for long periods. But again, it's in the tradition of the hidden imam, you know, that you can sort of just disappear for 5 or 6 months. It's more in sort of religious tradition. And actually, and these houses in Najaf, it's actually quite, the old house is very easy to disappear because they have enormous cellars going down about 5 stories. So you could have quite, the old Muqtada house, or his father's house in Najaf, could look quite small at the beginning, but then there are lots of cellars underneath, because the way they kept things cool, stayed cool themselves. And also these are always meant to have passages going somewhere else, in case, so you can escape and so forth, which is also probably true. But he's always moved around. I was always actually real circumspect, I mean, with any Iraqi leader, of saying where is he at this moment, because it's so easily misinterpreted. And then if something does happen to him, of course, you're up a tree, but, you know, why was Patrick asking exactly where X was going to be, you know, and a day later a bomb explodes, you know, so you know how paranoid people are there, understandably.
Now, if a career advisor were to sit down with Muqtada AlSadr and say, where do you want to be in 5 years' time, what do you want to be doing in 10 years' time, what would he say?
What would he say? Well, he'd say you want the Americans out, which is reasonable, and he's always said that. But people will say, what does Muqtada really want? But actually, poor Muqtada, every time he gives a speech or a sermon or an interview, he always says exactly the same thing, which is his main objective is to end the occupation. So I think it's reasonable to say it's true. I mean, I think he has he has a sense that he wants to be the great religious leader. He never sees himself as a sort of leading a lot of militiamen. And in fact, the Sadrist movement is much bigger than the militiamen. People always say Muqtada AlSadr, leader of the Mahdi army. But actually, it's the political arm is just as big. They have offices all over Iraq with lots of sort of committees and so forth. And people were telling me that when there was a big clampdown in sort of last year, a lot of his people were being arrested by the Americans. The people he really wanted to save were his political lieutenants, not his military ones. He thought the military ones he could always replace. The political ones he couldn't. There's a sort of revolving groups of sort of sheikhs, I mean, in the, who he never seems to allow anybody to get too prominent, too powerful. generally.
And you say that he's very astute, that he'll enter a confrontation, but he'll always pull back. So
Sure,
that
you could see that.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, he survived Saddam. Not an easy thing to do. In the 90s, he was politically very experienced. In his 90s, these religious leaders in Iraq always tend to operate through their sons. His father had 4 sons. One was ill, but 3 others were his main lieutenants. So when he was in his 20s, Muqtada was sort of running the party magazine. They briefly had Saddam let them have a magazine. He sort of was running his father's office at one time. So he had a lot of sort of street experience of Iraqi politics in a way that almost no other leader who was in exile in London or New York or Damascus, wherever, would have had that sort of direct experience. And he, sorry, I forgot the question.
About him being astute and pulling back from the blame.
Yeah, you can see at every moment where there's a big crisis, he's always pulled back. During the when Saddam fell, he then takes over. His father's organization is reborn. He takes over a lot of Iraq, southern Iraq. Then he begins to accumulate a lot of enemies, gets a bit more cautious. But then in 2004, with the sieges of Najaf, Bremer thought Jerry Bremer, who must be one of the stupidest men ever to have had a official, had 2 contradictory beliefs. One, that Muqtada AlSadr was incredibly dangerous, a history of the Hitler of the Middle East. And at the same time, that Bremer could sort of send around a few cops who'd arrest him. And that would be the end of Muqtada AlSadr. Now, these 2 things, one could be true and the other could be true. They can't both be true. So then when he went for him in April 2004, started arresting his aides and closed his newspaper and so forth, then there was this tremendous explosion which completely caught him and the American army by surprise. They took over much of southern Iraq.
And when the Americans really didn't need that battle, the Americans really didn't need that battle.
They were fighting in the Battle of Fallujah, so they really couldn't survive that. But then after that, he was always looking for an agreement. It's always an agreement. We'll stop shooting, but if you do this, then the end of the year, August, you had the Second Battle of Najaf, which was. And his militiamen getting slaughtered. They weren't really trained, any of these people. They could use a gun, but they were up against the American army. But they fought very hard. But again, was always looking for an agreement and so forth.
Why did they fight so hard against the overwhelming military force of the Americans? I mean, it was often suicidal. We saw them do it.
Sure, yeah. They're very religious young men, not well educated. See Muqtada as being sort of semi-divine, also nationalistic against the occupation. So religion and nationalism coming together. And also people who've lived in Iraq since you've been brought up in the 1990s and, in mass poverty. I mean, you're probably extremely tough, But in Najaf, Najaf is very strange. There's this enormous cemetery where the Shia get buried, and everybody wants to get buried whenever he's killed in fighting and so forth. You can always see the taxis and cars with the coffins on the roofs taking them to the great cemetery there. And it's also, this is where, in the uprising against Saddam in '91 and again in other battles, they always try and grab the cemetery. It was very easy to fight in it. So I think that the supporters. Sorry, you mentioned that I sort of that some of them that I was caught at a checkpoint in Kufa in 2004, and they got very close to killing me and the 2 Iraqis who were with me. But they're very sort of committed, dangerous young men, but very sort of rather sort of simple. I mean, they were looking at. You mentioned I was wearing a keffiyeh. It's typical of Iraq that you think of defending yourself against one thing and you come another. I thought the very dangerous Sunni towns just to the north of Kufa. So I thought from a distance I'd wear a keffiyeh, and somebody I won't be obviously a foreigner. And I didn't actually think I was in danger from the Shia until we got to Kufa, out of the sort of those dangerous towns of just to the north of Mahmadiyya and so forth. So it's so I was caught by surprise. But they were sort of looking at things like cameras and Thuraya phones, intensely suspicious. These were things they hadn't seen before. But
and
completely
you're
committed.
essentially taken hostage briefly, aren't you? Or they
I was taken hostage. Yeah, I do it once. It's the beginning which is so dangerous, where they might just decide to kill you. And after all, tens and thousands of Iraqis have been killed like that, stopped at checkpoints. Somebody doesn't like them, they're the wrong religion. Somebody is suspicious of them, you get killed. Which is one of the reasons I put at the beginning of the book. One, it's a dramatic story, but also that is the sort of abiding experience of Iraqis, and that's the sort of strain under which people live the whole time. One can sort of talk about these things in a sort of distant political way. We were talking about the battle over the last week in Basra and Baghdad, but 500 people have been killed in these battles. 1,000 are wounded with a terrible hospital service. So, the Iraqis live under this, as you well know, under this continual strain and this terror of what's, the next checkpoint is going to be like. I went to Fallujah in end of January from Baghdad with some, I knew some police. Anyway,
in your disguise again, or?
What?
In your disguise again?
You don't bring up this disguise, though. It's something I permanently wore, sort of a large wig or something, but I don't. No, I was going to say, I went with, I knew some Iraqi police who told me, but there were 27 checkpoints between central Baghdad and Fallujah. Some of them quite ferocious, I mean, very difficult to get through. And Iraqis spend all their time moving. They're trying to get through these checkpoints. So it's a reason for having that chapter there, is to sort of explain what that's like, to have to live under these conditions where you're around every corner. There may be something, a checkpoint who you don't know who they are. And the more checkpoints, you might think more security, but actually more opportunity for somebody else to have a checkpoint which is who are gangsters, or are looking for Sunni to kill, or looking for Shia to kill, or looking for, you don't know what.
I don't want to be too greedy with my questions to Patrick. I think it's time to open it out to you. And Patrick's ready to take questions on Muqtada AlSadr or the wider situation in Iraq, which he knows so well. So if we start over there, can I ask you again, you can identify yourself or not, but just please wait for the mic before you ask your question.
Hello, Patrick. My name is Dr. Ali Al-Shahib. I'm from the Iraqi Prospect Organization. I'd like to first of all thank you for being so concerned about the Iraqi situation in the last 30 years. That's very brave of you, considering that situation hasn't been really well. I just wanted to point out and comment on some issues regarding the current situation in Basra. I think that the comments you have said are not very, quite unfair on the government side. The reason is that, unfortunately, the media haven't really portrayed the right image on what's happened on Basra. The reality is that Basra has been in the hands of gangs and mafias and militias since the British were there. And when the British they withdrew from Basra, then it became even worse. The police, they were controlled by the mafia, the gangs, the army, etc. So the whole Basra was occupied by gangs.
Can I ask you to be fairly
very
brief
quick
and maybe ask a question?
Sure. I'll
as well.
be very, very quick. So why I'm saying is that Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki had planned this surge for the last 3 months, and what his main objective, he is not sectarian at all. He's not targeting any Shia of any kind. He's not targeting the Mahdi army, nor anyone. He has come out several times. I saw him in Arabic TV today, this morning as well. His main intention is to go after these gangs and militias who are being backed by Arab countries and Iran, etc., to stop them smuggling oil, stealing, all sorts of these things. And very, very importantly, that Prime Minister Maliki is there not to gain a reputation of any kind of. He wants to take control as a Prime Minister. He wants to take control of Basra and stop these gangs and militias taking over. Thank you.
Fajri, do you want to comment?
Well, sure. I mean, I just really wouldn't agree with that. I think that the attack, when it came, was directed at the Mahdi army. I know he said these things, but he wasn't directed at the other militias, and everybody who was there seemed to agree with that, and that the same was true in other cities. So I think that it would have been wise if he had done that and done it later. There was a plan to do something like this in June, but to direct it against all the militias. But in fact what happened was a direct assault on the Mahdi army.
Question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Mike Barnes. I don't know whether this is within the context of the meeting, but what I'd like to ask is something about Iran and the effect this might have on Iraq. It was reported a few days ago that the Americans are putting a very strict embargo, financial and other, on the Iraqi government, and Iraqi banks and so on will no longer be able to transfer money, etc., etc. A bit like the Cuban one, actually. Could you say anything about that, and whether it's likely to affect Iran's attitude to what they're actually doing in Iraq, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. I think it's quite difficult to impose an embargo on Iran, which is really effective. Obviously, you know, the Iranians will get more upset. They'll want to. I mean, one Iraqi politician said to me, look, the Iranians can afford to compromise in Iraq, but they can't afford to lose in Iraq. And I think that that's true. You know, one of the funny things is the Iranians support the present government of Iraq. They support the Maliki government, so does the US. But it doesn't like the Iranians having influence there. You know, it's sort of, they keep, you know, if you listen to American politicians, you'd think that the Iranians were opposed to the present Iraqi government. Actually, they've always supported, but it's about as good as it's going to get, because it's a Shia Kurdish government. It's full of people who, you know, speak Farsi at home. It's, so they have a reason to keep it in power, which the Saudis, the Jordanians, the others don't. And somebody, I mean, Hosha Zebari, the foreign minister, was saying to me, he said, during one of the meetings, which he got the Americans and the Iranians to come along to in Sharm el-Sheikh, that each side would get to their feet and denounce the other for the horrid things they were doing in Iraq, and then make very similar speeches in support of the Iraqi government. So the Iranians, yeah, I mean, they're going to, I don't think the embargo will really affect their attitude that much. If there was an armed attack, that's going to affect it. If there was something approaching an armed attack, that would affect it. But an embargo by itself, I don't think so.
A question there at the back.
Thank you. Basil Jibori, I'm an Iraqi journalist. During the last confrontation between the government and the Sadri movement in 2004, we saw Ayatollah Sistani taking a big step in diffusing the situation. Yet we saw him silent, and actually the Sadris asked, not by naming him, but they have asked the highest authority in Najaf to intervene in stopping the government from attacking them. Why, in the way that you read things, why the Sistani has kept himself away from the problem this time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I thought, like possibly you do, or a lot of Iraqis do, that he was silent because he agreed with it. It was because of the tense agreement, because of the tension between Sistani supporters and the supporters of Al-Sadr, that just basically he was remaining silent, meant assent to the attack on Basra. I mean, that was certainly how it was interpreted, I think, by lots of Iraqis. And that's one of the things which kind of spoke volumes. He didn't say anything. And there always has been this tension between Muqtada and the the rest of basically the established, most of the established clergy.
Loads of hands going up. Over there, Cam with the mic. Sorry. Third row, yeah.
Michael Savage, The Independent. I was wondering if we could carry on this sort of theme of career advice for Muqtada. And seeing as he seems to be on some sort of fast-track Ayatollah conversion course at the moment, how much respect does he get from religious leaders, as you were just discussing, in the sort of broader region as well?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a misconception that, you know, he has authority so fast because of the family he comes from the Al-Sadr family, because his father was a martyr, his brothers, his father-in-law, everybody was killed. So this is enormously respected by a lot of Shia Iraqis. So, yeah, would it be good to become an Ayatollah? But he doesn't actually need that to get religious respect, because it works in a slightly different way. Sure, he'd like to increase his religious status, but it is something that Iraqi people, members of the Iraqi clergy, when they don't want to talk to anyone, they don't want to disappear, it's always good to say, I'm now pursuing my religious studies. I mean, it would be when they don't want to say anything. So it is probably important to him to do this, but he already has religious credibility because of his family background.
A question over there, right, on the left of the room.
Yeah, my name is Jean Whalen. I'm a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about, you know, what he actually does day to day and how he lives. Does he live modestly, lavishly? Does he have money? You know, what is his daily routine, if he has one?
I mean, he's somebody who moves around the whole time. There are different sort of safe houses. Live, so far as I know, pretty modestly. And actually most of the clerical leaders do. They often have access to large sums of money, but you don't see it, and you don't see it in terms of Muqtada. He has meetings, meets with people. I mean, like a lot of other Iraqi, he tries. There's a clear evidence he tries not to have a routine. In other words, going, you know, leading Friday prayers in Kufa or somewhere. He doesn't. It's not regular. But that's true of almost anybody in Iraq. If you're in a leadership position, for obvious reasons, you don't want to have a regular routine, given the number of people who have been assassinated. And it's sort of the same with Muqtada. Actually, most of the time since 2003, very elusive. I mean, the bit in the book that the National Security Advisor, Muqtada who's not sort of close to the Americans, is quite convinced that in 2004, there was a meeting arranged between Muqtada and Muqtada to discuss a peace agreement. And just before they met, the Americans attacked the house they were going to meet. He's convinced that it was an attempt to kill Muqtada. Now, you know, there are lots of conspiracy theories in Iraq, but the fact that it comes from the established National Security Advisor sort of convinced me there might be some truth in it. So it's generally, you know, a very sort of disorganized, disjointed life, moving from sort of safe house to safe house, not going out very much.
Another question here at the front.
Thank you. Lauch Mauer, the Embassy of the Czech Republic. The British troops in Basra are now just on the Basra airport, and for this year this was announced that the number of them will decrease. That probably will not be the case after current involvement or after current operations. So what do you think can we see in current situation and the future direct involvement of the troops in any sort of Iraqi government operation directly on the ground?
I don't think so. I don't think it'd be politically possible here. And I don't see, you know, they were in Basra. They were in Basra with a larger number of troops. It didn't get in them anywhere. Why should it do better the second time round? It's very, you know, all they'd really be is once again be a target. You know, and the problem comes up with the British again and again, which is a simple one. At the beginning, the British, in a rather patronizing way, used to say to the British officers, used to say to the Americans that they had rich experience of counterinsurgency because of Malaya and Northern Ireland. And I remember actually a captain in British military intelligence saying that gets it exactly wrong and misunderstands the problem in Basra, that in Northern Ireland, you know, there was one side, essentially the Protestants. In Malaya, there was the other side, the Malayans. There was a majority that supported the British. He said the problem in Basra is nobody really supports us. There are moments when somebody, for tactical reasons, might support us. Might be people who say they support us. But at the end of the day, we've got no allies. And that was the problem from the beginning, and it's still the problem.
There's a question over there, the second row.
Thank you. My name is Ali Molawi. I'm a postgraduate student. Would you agree that Muqtada AlSadr doesn't have complete control over the Mahdi army and that there are criminal gangs operating under the guise of the Jaish al-Mahdi? And in that case, how should the Iraqi government respond to or to confront these criminal gangs without being accused of taking a sectarian line or a party political line to take down these criminal gangs?
Yeah, I don't think anybody's accusing the Iraqi government of being sectarian. I guess it was afterwards the government is essentially Shia, and so are the militias. Yeah, sure, this is true. I mean, it's sort of criminal gangs, death squads. They operated there. The problem that I think with the Iraqi government, with all this, I'm broadening it out. There was somebody else who asked this question. You know, the Iraqi government going to clean up corruption, criminal gangs. Well, you know, when I'm living in Baghdad and having dealings with the Iraqi government, you know, I must say, if they're fighting a battle against corruption, they're not doing too well. You know, and this is true of the other militia. It's pervasive, and it's true of almost everything. You want something, you bribe. Better, slightly easier for the rich, appalling for the poor. So I don't really believe the claims of the Iraqi government when it comes to that. But are they going to be able to purge the militias of that? They can reduce it. I doubt if they're going to do more, because all the militias have got. Some of these assets are worth a lot. You know, you control petrol stations, you can make a lot of money. Sometimes the petrol stations are controlled by the militia, sometimes by the army. You can control refineries, you can control oil, you know. I mean, there is money in Iraq. This is not Somalia. And people who've got their hands on it are not going to give it up. And, I mean, this has been going on a long time. You know, the Basra oil refinery the Supreme Council used to have a political office in the refinery because they had a certain cut of the profits. This is true of all the militias and all the political parties.
It's actually one of the stories that I think hasn't been that well told, although you've certainly tried, but many of us didn't tell it as well as we could. The astonishing corruption. I was told once by one official that there was absolute corruption in every ministry at every level.
No, absolutely. It's sort of
And of course the Americans have to take some of the responsibility for...
Yeah, and it's also pretty suspicious. I mean, for instance, 2005, the entire military procurement budget got stolen. $1.2 billion. Not a bit, but just all of it disappeared. And the former defense minister, who used to be in London in the 1990s and was well known among other Iraqi businessmen, that first of all he'd say, could I sort of go into business with you? And you'd say no. And then he'd say, well, could I borrow £100? And you'd say yes. So he's always... And now is building a house in Amman which has 3 swimming pools. 2 outside, 1 inside. This is true of all of every aspect of government. And also, so you know, I mean, yeah, is it true of the militias? Yes, but I mean, the whole structure of society is being rotted by corruption.
Question from Alan over there.
Alan Phelps. Patrick, you've been very modest about the dangers of working as a reporter in Iraq. If hypothetically a young reporter, say 24-year-old, came up to you and said they would like to work in Baghdad, what would you say to them? And perhaps we could hear Caroline's view on that point too.
Well, I mean, I used to say, but you know, people not about Iraq, if people are becoming reporters, that, you know, first of all, you learn how to write an article, and then the quickest way to rise through the ranks is to go to somewhere fairly dangerous, where older journalists have found rather good reasons not to go. The problem with Iraq is that there's no learning curve, because you can't afford to make a mistake. So, I mean, not to be too, I remember hiring a young freelancer who was fantastically gung-ho and brave, and somewhat later, I'd been away, came back, my driver came to me and said, well, the car isn't operating too well. The reason is that the guy who you hired to do some freelance thought it'd be a good idea to go to Abu Ghraib prison, dressed up as an Arab, although he was in fact an American, and didn't speak Arabic. And he thought there'd be interesting people outside the prison, which there were. I mean, the relatives of the people inside. And for a few minutes, after a few minutes, they suddenly realized there was an American in their midst. So my driver said the only reason he thought they got back safe to Baghdad was that there were two gangs of kidnappers trying to kidnap the same guy. I mean, actually, he was a very nice guy who in other circumstances would have learned, don't do this, but in Iraq you can't. Caroline, were talking about this before. One of the problems at the moment, you can have people who've been there before, like you, Alan and Caroline, you have a certain capital of knowledge you've built up. But now it's so difficult to move around that if you don't have that capital of knowledge, somebody arriving cold to Iraq, it's extraordinarily difficult, whether they're 24 or 34.
And I don't think I would recommend setting up freelance there. I think that would be extraordinarily difficult from my experience. I mean, with the BBC, obviously, we have a sort of established office there with security advisors whose advice we usually heeded. But it is a fascinating place. Someone's got to do it. And someone's, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's peculiarly difficult to report. And one of the frustrating things over the last 4 or 5 years has been to hear Tony Blair and so forth, and other American, Bush, saying, you know, there are parts of Iraq, people just report about Baghdad, there are parts of Iraq that you never hear of. And they give the impression that, you know, there's pastoral calm outside Baghdad and Basra and a few other places. But of course, the reason we don't report them is you'd be dead if you tried, you know. And none of these people who claim that it's there never actually volunteer to go and test, you know, go to these places that are supposedly peaceful. And and particularly before 2004, I remember before the presidential election, where there was sort of practically a lie a minute out of the White House about the state of Iraq. And they were continually saying, you know, that it's a false and exaggerated picture has been given. And it was unprovable. You couldn't prove the opposite without getting killed.
Kathleen O'Hara, I'm a Canadian journalist. I'm wondering about economics. I know when Bremer came in, he passed all these, what I call hyper-capitalist orders to bring in free trade and privatization and allow corporate profits to go out without any kind of taxation. Just seemed a basic rape of the country. And I wondered how much that would affect someone like Al-Sadr. I mean, are they politically, economically astute? You say that he represents the poor. What would he think about that kind of thing, and what would he offer instead?
I don't know how much they think about it. I mean, because things are in such a bad state, you know, you can't have factories, because if you don't have permanent supply of electricity, you know. So the sort of things that Bremer introduced were sort of, you know, were really irrelevant to most of the problems. I mean, many of these were bad ideas, but they didn't even get off the ground as bad ideas, because if you have no electricity, a factory can't work, you know. these days, the transport system is, people can't transport things. So you go into even the smallest market in Baghdad, you look at the apples, they're American apples. You know, you look at the bananas, they're Moroccan. You know, none of it comes. The fruit-growing province used to be Diyala, which is one of the most dangerous places in the country. So even at the most primitive level, the economy doesn't work. You can't move goods from A to B. They can't, you know, they can't. So what the duties that you have on goods entering or exiting the country doesn't really matter at the moment. It might do in future, but at the moment I don't think it does. I've never really focused on it. I mean, it's sort of there's a general sense among Iraqis that somebody wants their oil and they're going to keep it. So anything to do with the oil, people react. The Kurds say overreact, try to give contracts to foreign companies. But there is a sense they're after our oil. I think almost all Iraqis believe that, one way or another. So that's the that's the one aspect of the economy they do focus on. But other aspects, I don't think they do.
How do you think the British and Americans should try and extradite themselves from this mess? And insofar as they do it, can they do it in any way which makes matters better for the Iraqi people, or will it be just the case of us clearing out and leaving them in an even worse state than they are now?
Well, you know, one way or another the occupation has to end, and will end at some point. And there are pluses and minuses. To my mind, the minuses are far greater, you know. Often foreigners, you talk to people in the green zone, foreigners, even a lot of Iraqis say, oh yes, all Iraqis, and all opinion polls show that Iraqis say they want the foreigners to go, the occupation to end, but if you talk to them privately, they don't. I think this is really baloney. Clearly, the occupation provoked a war, guerrilla war with the Sunni. Occupying forces can't really mediate between different ethnic and sectarian groups. You know, that has to end. But it has to be ended by negotiations with people who really have power. I mean, as we've seen, the Americans don't want to talk to the Iranians substantively, but we've seen in the last week, why did the fighting in Basra ended? Well, it ended largely because of Iranian intervention. You know, you can pretend in the green zone. I remember talking to people not so long ago in the green zone, senior diplomats and others, saying, oh, you know, the Muqtada doesn't matter and so forth. Mahdi army becoming irrelevant, etc. Complete nonsense. But you have to actually deal with real people who have real power. You may not like them. But so far the Americans have sort of refused to do that. You know, the one American success of Al-Sadr, the awakening councils, these Sunni groups that were attacking the Americans, now being allied to the Americans because they were suddenly prepared. For a long time they said, we're not going to talk to people who've got American blood on their hands. Well, now they've got people with American blood on their hands all working for them. You have this enormous Sunni militia, 90,000 strong. So if they accept a certain role for the Iranians, if they accept that people like the Sadrists who are anti-American are going to play a very significant role, then I think you might begin to move towards the end of this conflict. But it's very difficult to do at this stage. Things that could have been done in 2003, 2004, you can't do anymore. I mean, basically, in Baghdad, Shia and Sunni Arabs hate and fear each other more than they hate and fear the Americans. I mean, for very good reason. If you're a Sunni in Baghdad and somebody kicks your door in 3 in the morning, you'd much prefer it to be an American soldier than you would from somebody from the police commandos who's probably going to murder you. But that's but it doesn't resolve anything. The Americans aren't resolving anything there. So an end to the occupation has to be part of a resolution. Talking with people who really have power has to be part of the resolution. Talking with the neighbors, the Syrians, the Iranians has to be part of the solution. But civil wars build up their own momentum of hatred anywhere. And it's going to be very difficult for that to diffuse that.
There's another question there at the back.
John Hamilton, Gulf States Newsletter. Patrick, in your talk you mentioned that the government's attack on the militias in Basra was probably motivated by a desire to control the city leading up to the provincial elections in October. Presumably the way things turned out have actually put the Sadr movement in a very strong position looking towards those elections. So what chance do you think there is of the government actually going ahead with them? And how important do you think they are for future development of Iraq?
I think they probably will happen now. The Sadrists want them. Exactly what happened in the election is a slightly different question. I mean, if you control somewhere on the ground, does that mean you can control the election? Will the elections be fixed, in other words? So difficult to know what the outcome will be. I mean, it's sort of strange. The Americans wanted elections because the Sunni refused to take part in the last provincial elections in 2005. So you have provinces like in the north, which are controlled by Kurdish councils in Sunni majority places, like Mosul, Nineveh. And so they feel that's a favor to the Sunni. But in the south, the Sadrists are likely to win. You know, elections by themselves aren't going to resolve anything. We saw that in 2005. But at least it might produce a pattern where people who are a majority in a certain area are, that their representatives win the election. But exactly what effect it would be, I find it difficult to work out at this stage.
My name is Dima Zadine from BBC Arabic TV. People often, when they talk about Iraq, they talk about the Sunni-Shia confrontation and struggle. But a Middle Eastern journalist would say that it's only a passing phase from Iraq after invasion. The real struggle still to come is between Shia and Shia sectors, Muqtada and Al-Hakim sectors from one part, and Al-Sahwa and Al-Qaeda, Sunni-Sunni struggle as well. What do you think about that?
I think that there'll be struggles on each side, but I think the main struggle will be between Shia and Sunni. I think that, you know, there's in the Middle East and in Iraq itself, people often say to me, oh, you exaggerate, you know, communal differences. And Sunni and Shia used to get on fine. But, I mean, first of all, you say, well, hold on a minute. How about the 1991 uprising? Maybe 1,000 Shia killed. And people sort of deceive them. But it's not just the Middle East. I mean, in Baghdad, for instance, you talk sometimes to people, and they say, oh, you know, Shia are my friends, my sister-in-law, my sister is married to a Shia, etc. And you think, what do you think of Muqtada? What do you think of Sistani? What do you think of Malik? Oh, they're all Iranians, all Iranians, all Iranians. And Shia will also claim to be completely non-sectarian. But when you start talking about sort of Sunni, they say, oh, that guy's Al-Qaeda and so forth. It's not just the Middle East. I mean, I remember in Northern Ireland, I used to be in Belfast, and people would say, oh, yeah, in the Catholic Protestants, they'd all exaggerate. I have many friends who are Catholic, you know. For instance, Jimmy down there at number 84, he's Catholic, and so, you know, in that other street, he's Catholic. You realize they're completely encyclopedic knowledge of the sectarian origins of all their friends. But they were quite convinced in their own heart that they were sort of non-sectarian, and they'd all been dreamed up by the press.
Kind of a follow-up on that question. Since
Sadr is seen more as Iraqi nationalist than Syri or Dawa. Is there a chance that there can be some sort of alliance between them and the concerned Sunni citizens?
I think it's a good question. I think it's very difficult to do because we've had this sort of civil war in Baghdad, and you have to do practical things. For instance, lots of people in Baghdad have lost their houses. 1 in 9 out of Iraqis, probably the real figure's higher, is a refugee inside or outside the country. They can't get their houses back. Now, people are moving. Sunni who came from tough Sunni areas share the same. Maybe some of them move back, but otherwise you don't dare go back to a mixed area if you lost your house. Even a mistake to inquire too closely about what happened to your house was people who've taken your house, they go for you, or you think that's true. There are lots of revenge killings. Somebody's taken your house, you can't get it back, you have them killed, And so there's been real changes, demographic changes on the ground. So it's not something that you can't reverse something like that with words. Now, Muqtada says, that I am religiously a Shia, but I'm politically a Sunni, and says good things about the Sunni. But then if this was reinforced by real action on the ground, and furthermore, I have ordered that in these areas where Sunni have lost their houses, they get their houses back, nothing happens to them, anybody who does anything to them will deal with them, then this would be real. But unless that happens, then I think, it's just words. They could. I mean, you could do these deals and so forth. So it's a bit artificial, You meet these parliamentarians in the green zone. They haven't been out for a long time, Also, there's difficulty getting a quorum there. An awful lot of them you can find in Amman or actually down the street in London. You take the planes between Baghdad and Amman, an awful lot of Iraqi politicians on board. So they don't. It might have some effect, but there's something a bit artificial about what happens in Parliament.
Any more questions?
Yeah, hi. I just wondered if you could make a comment on how far Muqtada's power goes beyond the symbolic, especially at the tactical level on the ground. Thanks.
I think it's quite strong. I think people have said, Muqtada doesn't control his own guys, but the essential thing is that when he's called a ceasefire, there has been a ceasefire. Some people stay outside it for a bit, but they can't really exist outside the umbrella of his organization. I mean, a dangerous thing to it at a quite practical level, for instance, let's say you get kicked out of the Mahdi army and you're denounced in the local mosque. Now, probably somebody who's been kicked out has a lot of people looking for revenge against him. He immediately becomes vulnerable to somebody killing him. But he's at the end of the day, he does control it. And also, I mean, I don't want to give too many points to Muqtada. It's convenient for the Sadrists at various moments when people they don't like have something unpleasant happen to them. They can say, oh, dearie me, it's rogue elements over which we have no control, What are we to do? Actually, they've got a very good idea what they could do about it, but they don't do it. So, and you've seen that from the beginning. There's always been a suspiciously large number of people who have, for instance, Said Majid al-Khawi was killed in 2003 at the very beginning. He was another religious leader, went to Najaf and was killed. Were direct orders given to kill him? Probably not. But there's always been a sort of loose element around the Mahdi army, which they say they don't control, but they probably have a little bit more control than they admit. But to the other question, yeah, I do think they control it. And control it more than they did 3 or 4 years ago.
A question here at the front.
Can you give us...
Or do you want to just wait for the mic if you don't mind?
Yes. Can you give us your personal reasons of why Saddam was to be gotten rid of in the first place? Because he seemed to be a perfectly, convenient guy for the Americans, because he was a political, religious. He cut off many heads, and he was an American friend in the first place.
It's a strange thing, isn't it? I remember December 2002. There was a meeting of the Iraqi opposition just actually the end of Trade Street in the Metropolitan Hotel here, and I was talking to lots of Iraqis, most of whom are in the government now. I have been in the government, and although people say lots of things against the exiles, I mean, they're pretty smart. And I remember one guy saying to me, he said, "I have just one fear, that the Americans are going to realize what they're about to do in getting rid of Saddam is not in their own interests." I mean, this is somebody who was deeply desirous of getting rid of Saddam, and it was sort of true. I mean, why didn't, put it another way, in 1991, early 1991, I remember a friend of mine in the Foreign Office telling me that the British Foreign Office had a meeting of all people who were going to be involved in the war before it came. And they had some military, and they had British diplomats, all the British Gulf ambassadors from the Gulf. And one question, this wasn't a policy making meeting, it was a general discussion. But then one of the questions was, should we go on to Baghdad? Obviously we're going to defeat Saddam, should we go to Baghdad? And I remember my friend saying, without exception, all the Gulf ambassadors and the others said no, because we go on to Baghdad, overthrow Saddam, we've got to have elections. The elections are going to be won by the Shia religious parties. The Shia religious parties are related to Iran. Without Saddam, the Iranian influence is going to increase. This is going to be one of the most radical changes in the Middle East ever. And we've just about to invade Kuwait and throw Saddam out to avoid radical change in the Middle East. So the first Gulf War, launched by the first President Bush, was conservative, because to restore the status quo ante. The second war was radical, and far more radical than they realized. It was revolutionary, because there was going to be a change of who held power in Iraq. It was going to change relations with all the neighbors. Now, one, they didn't really think about it. Secondly, they just won in Afghanistan. It all seemed very easy. I mean, so they thought, get rid of Saddam, quite easy to install sympathetic people there. They didn't realize the sort of revolutionary nature of what they were about to do. But it's unavoidable. And Iraq will only settle down when they sort of accept that. And it's not really going to be in their interests. But I don't, other reasons they did it, you see, immediately after, the war itself seemed to be like Afghanistan. It seemed very easy. Everybody said it'd be difficult, or so there'll be some difficulties, and there they were in Baghdad. They'd lost hardly any people. So, now we have lots of discussion about who took the decision to dissolve the Iraqi army and the police and other disastrous, the Iraqi army and other disastrous decisions. But actually, I was there at the time. They didn't actually care much what Iraqis thought, because they thought it didn't really matter. It was only later, when the guerrilla war started, they suddenly realized it mattered a whole lot. And Saddam had gone down, but the Iraqis wouldn't fight for him. Even the sort of special Republican Guard that were well-trained and tribally linked to Saddam went home. So Iraqis didn't fight, whether they were Shia or Sunni or whatever. So that gave an impression of weakness, and it doesn't matter what Iraqis think. Then they learned later that it mattered a whole lot what Iraqis thought. But that was another reason that why overthrowing Saddam, they didn't see the downside from their point of view.
So it was a mere execution of this axle of evil thing.
Yeah, I mean, I worked briefly for a think tank in Washington, or as I was just a couple of months before, because I just wanted to see what the atmosphere was in Washington. It was one of extreme hubris, because the war in Afghanistan seemed so easy. Actually, exactly the same thing had happened in Afghanistan. There wasn't much of a war in Afghanistan that I ever saw. It's one of the sort of misconceptions of television. You see sort of lots of smoke, big bangs. But actually, most of the Taliban had gone home. They'd gone home as they were being paid to go home, because they thought they'd lose. And they've been probably thought better to fight another day, which is exactly what happened. But it looked as though it was real easy. So an atmosphere of extreme hubris. And all these things came together. And
that carried on into the lack of planning, but that's a whole other subject. But I always remember one official thing from OHA, the precursor to the CPA, saying we can't organise ourselves, let alone a country. I mean, you realised immediately on the ground that it was going wrong, didn't you?
Yeah, and Petraeus was one of the few. I mean, I think his reputation maybe now exaggerated. Was one of the few. I remember I knew him as commander of the 101st Division in Mosul that time, who did spend a lot of time thinking about what Iraqis thought. He did realize, for instance, that banning all former Baathists from having jobs was a real disaster. So he'd organized, I remember, these sort of meetings in which everybody, all these former officers, and Mosul is full of officers, pledged, sort of denounced the Baath. It was like sort of Baptist meetings. But the key thing, I talked to all these guys afterwards, and they're saying, yeah, we need jobs, we're selling our furniture, our children can't go to school. And he could say this was very important. He understood that this actually mattered, what these people thought, in a way that the other American generals at that time didn't.
Any more questions? One over there.
Please, if we would like just to enlarge the photo of Muqtada AlSadr, do you think that the flowery dream of introducing democracy in the Middle East will be repeated again in other countries? Thank you.
Well, look, there's been one, what happened? There's been one successful elections in the Middle East. I mean, Hamas was elected and on a heavily monitored election, won a majority, and immediately had an embargo declared on them by the Americans and most of the rest of them, the Europeans. The elections in 2005, you know, it was evident. This is not a reason for not having those elections, but it was obvious that those elections were not going to solve everything. Because you have an election where people are agreed on the rules of the game. If people say those rules are grossly unfair and we're not going to recognize the result, it isn't going to do you a lot of good. And it may do you harm because it sort of tainted democracy with the victory of one side. Now, there is a counter-argument, which you know, that the majority of Iraqis wanted, the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds wanted elections. They won the elections. But there was no agreement on what the rules under which Iraq should be run were going to be. So they didn't really resolve anything. In many ways, they made them worse.
We probably have time for a couple more questions, if there are any.
Danny Monday. I wonder what you think the hopes for harmony in Iraq now are, or whether things will continue to get worse and become more sectarian, and whether some division in future is a solution.
Well, the country is sort of divided, but it may remain a federation. So I think that that's going to happen. It's very difficult to see how you sort of undivided it. That will be a long process. Sectarianism, you know, are we through the worst? We might be, you know, in some ways. It's again, that's difficult to tell. There have been various, you know, we've had some bad bombings recently. There hasn't been tit-for-tat killings as we have before. People are exhausted. Reducing sectarianism, I think very difficult to do, just with too many people being killed and there have been real demographic moves. Very difficult to put those into reverse. But you can see what Iraqis think about the situation is that the refugees are not coming back. You know, when you hear sort of optimistic stuff from the Iraqi government or the Americans or the British, if this was true, people would be coming back. They're not having a great time in Damascus. They're running out of money. They can't get jobs, but they're not coming back. And some people who do come back then go back to Damascus or Amman.
One more question at the front.
Thank you. Have you been able to discern any difference in what Barack Obama or Mrs. Clinton say about what they would do come next January from what's going on at the moment? And if so, what is it?
I don't know. I mean, they sort of... I wonder how far they have a clear picture of what the situation is in Iraq. I mean, you could know. If you follow the American papers, you go to the best writers on the web and say, well, you can actually know what's happening in Iraq. Television, you can't, because it's too... maybe it's something that happened to American television, or maybe television just isn't a medium. It's too complicated to explain. But I have a sense that they don't really understand, that any of the American politicians in Washington don't really understand what's happening. I mean, some it's obvious, McCain and so forth. You know, turned up a year ago, he turned up in Sharjah Market in Baghdad and said, you know, the American people don't understand, don't have a clear picture of what's happening, it's better than they're told. He came back, I mean, I was there during his visit about 3 weeks ago, and he didn't go to Sharjah Market, maybe because it's under the control of the Mahdi army these days. So it wouldn't have looked too good. So how much difference will it make if they get in? Well, obviously it will make a difference from McCain. But I think the problem is that the ambitions with which they went in were so great. You know, this is the test of America as a superpower. It's very difficult to know how do you get out, how do you conduct a retreat without that looking too humiliating and sort of resigning your position as a world superpower. And there's always the sense also, we stay on, maybe things will get better. Maybe the turn is coming. You know, look how the Democrats got terrified when the surge came, that maybe we'd bet on the wrong horse. Maybe suddenly there's going to be a victory here and we're going to lose the election. But I mean, overall, not very optimistic that they'll have a clear idea of what they're going to do when they get in, whether it's Obama or Mrs. Clinton.
There's one more question at the back, right at the back, I'm afraid.
I think you very eloquently testified to the horror that Baghdad is for many people who live there at the moment and other people who wish to live there. However, I recall before the war began in 2003, reading the amnesty reports on the way Saddam behaved towards his own people and finding that particularly difficult to come to terms with. Had the war not happened, had he not been invaded, can you comment on how you would feel about the prolonging of that regime?
I mean, I'd feel bad about it, and I feel... You know, I was talking a couple of weeks ago to one Iraqi who was living near my hotel in Baghdad, and I say, we're talking about the occupation. He said, yeah, I'm against the occupation by the Americans. He said, you know, first of all, we were occupied by the British, then we were occupied, then Qasem came in, then we've been occupied by the Ba'ath Party for 30 years, and now we have the Americans occupying. He said, all these occupations, he said, seem to me an awful lot very similar. The Iraqis, I mean, as I said earlier, I think that if the Americans had simply overthrown Saddam, I think Iraqis would have been fairly grateful. Also, if the man on the moon had overthrown Saddam, they would have been grateful. But they hadn't, and this was what Iraqis said at the time, what every poll showed, did not want to be occupied, and who does?
You talk in the book, Patrick, about the cult of cruelty of the former regime.
Yeah, I mean, the Ba'ath Party was always extraordinarily sort of brutal. It was also a sort of minority of a minority, so they kind of needed to do that. I mean, Iraq is a fairly, you know, as you know, is a pretty tough place anyway. I mean, maybe, because this was a sort of frontier society for a long time. Under the Ottomans didn't really control much. Between about the Mongols, which is 1258, and the British, a lot of Iraqis, there wasn't any real central government. There is a sort of tendency to, it doesn't explain the dreadful things happening in Iraq, but, you know, it is a strange place where everybody is armed. And this has always been so. You know, it's not like Ceausescu. I mean, even under Saddam, everybody had a gun. I remember in the early 90s, Iraqi officials telling me Saddam had a buyback program for heavy weapons. No, not ordinary Kalashnikovs we expected everybody to have, but heavy weapons that you paid money to get them back. And they said that a tribe in southeast Iraq had turned up with 3 tanks and wanted to sell them back to the government. And the government offered a price, and they said not enough, and disappeared down the road with their 3 tanks. And it still says, I mean, there is pre-existing violence. It's in Iraq. You know, and you can see that at various stages. You know, the monarchy ends in 1958 in Iraq. You know, when the king and the others, the court, try and flee out the back of his palace, they're all machine gunned down. You know, in Egypt, you know, the king sails out in his yacht. If you look at Iraqi history, it is a fairly violent on every occasion. There used to be a museum in Iraq, a military museum, which had pictures of all former leaders. And underneath it had sort of killed, assassinated, and then it had King Ghazi, which it said killed in traffic accident. Then after it said brackets, arranged.
Well, the book is full of great anecdotes. Talking of kind of violent deaths, I like one of the anecdotes in the book where there's looting at the National History Museum, and even the head of the dinosaur is lopped off. It is for sale in the corner. It is a great book. It's beautifully written, very very erudite. Anyone who wants a history of the complex world of Shia politics will learn a lot from it. No one will suffer any violence if they don't buy it, but Patrick might be willing to sign a copy or 2. I know that you said that you were reluctant to write this book because you thought it was too dangerous, but I think we're all very grateful that you did and that you came to talk here this afternoon. So thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you.